unmute you, but every time I do that, I tend to mute right at the moment that someone else is unmuting. And so I, in effect, mute them. All right. Well, if you can see me, Sam, give me a wave, or hear me, give me a wave. There we go. There we go. All right, cool. Well, guys, we're going to continue in our study of Hebrews tonight. We're going to be starting into Hebrews chapter 4. We're only going to look at 2 verses, and I think there's a reason why the Lord had stopped me at 2 verses. Hebrews 4 is a very thick chapter. There's a lot to it. But these 2 verses, as we begin, I think really reveal a lot about community as Christians. But really, Hebrews chapter 4, continuing on the theme of Hebrews chapter 3, where Hebrews 3 was Jesus is the superior Moses. Hebrews chapter 4, the entirety of it is Jesus is the superior Joshua, who leads us to the superior rest. And so for us tonight, we're going to start with kind of, once again, a part 1 into this. And so as we begin, what I'd like to do, since we've got a few more of us on here tonight, Reiners, if you all will take Numbers 14, 1 through 10, we're going to come to that in a moment, and that's going to be very important to the entirety of what we're learning tonight. Brother Sam, if you will do Romans 10, 16, and 17. And Heather, if you will look up James 1:22, that you might be able to know from memory. But we will get to those here in just a moment. But as we kind of start into this, what I want to do is also kind of take a look at where we were last week. Since Hebrews 4, 1 and 2 start with a therefore, it's going to be very important that we have the entire picture and remind ourselves of what we were looking at last week. So we were seeing that Jesus is superior to Moses, and we were also looking at the Israelites' failure of unbelief caused them to not enter into the promised land. So looking at Hebrews 3, 16, 17, or 16 through 19, it says, "For who provoked him when they had heard? Indeed, did not all of those who came out of Egypt led by Moses? And with whom was he angry for 40 years? Was it not those who had sinned and whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient?" So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. So we see that this first ending section is speaking of one particular community, and that community is the Israelites as they were coming out of Egypt. Now we pick up where we're starting tonight, Hebrews 4, 1 and 2. "Therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. For indeed, we have had good news preached to us, just as they also. But the word that they heard did not profit them, because it was not united by faith in those who heard." So there's a lot that's going on, even just 2 verses here. But what I first want to point out is, you see I have this linking graph right here, starting with therefore, and it's linking up to verse 19. So we see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief. So really, this is a tale of 2 communities as we look at this, or a tale of 2 peoples. And where we have looked at the last group, and we see the Israelites' failure to enter into God's rest, the author of Hebrews is giving his readers a warning. Therefore, let us not be in the same way. But I think it's important as we do this, as we kind of step away from this, that we first kind of look at these pronouns. We see in 19, they, and then we come to verse 1, us, and then the more specific you. And this is going to be important as we move through this. But another concept that we need to understand as we step into these 2 verses is really the message that's being given here. And when we look back to the Old Testament, and then we compare it to what's happening in Hebrews, it's a tale of, like I said, of 2 communities. But those communities have a very similar outline. And that's why I kind of even highlighted right here that we have good news preached to us just as they have had also. This is a story about a people, a guide, a promised land, and a promised rest. And both are going to apply as we move through this. And if we were to kind of sketch this out, when we look at 3 and 16 through 19, the people are the Israelites. I think I spelled that wrong. Their guide was Moses. And in this case, as we're going to move forward, Joshua. The promised land, Cana, and the promised rest was rest, a stoppage. We can also put off on the side here, peace. So that's what we see in 3:16 through 19. We're going to touch on what we're going to see now in just a moment. But as we move forward on this, the reason why I really kind of want to draw all this out is that last week, as we were looking to this, we kind of need to remember that the people the author of Hebrews are writing to are under some form of pressure. It may be pressure from the outside, from a Gentile world that is trying to persecute them. But there's also a lot of pressure internally from Hebrews, from Israelites, from Jews that are saying you need to abandon this Christ-focused way and come back to the teachings of Moses. Aren't you one of us? Why are you abandoning Moses and the prophets in favor of this Jesus? And so really from this, what the author of Hebrews was drawing out last time that we kind of touched on, but really I think the best way to solidify this is that these same people who rejected God and rejected Moses are now pressuring the people that the author of Hebrews is writing to say, you need to reject God. That's really kind of what he's really pointing at in this is the same ones that rejected God back in the day are trying to get you to do it again. They're trying to get you to reject the one true God in Jesus by saying, abandon Jesus and go back to Moses. Moses is, he said, is a faithful servant, and he guided the house of Israel. But Jesus is the covenant son, and he built the house. So don't go back to Moses. Stay with Jesus. So now he's comparing those two groups. He says, all right, look, the group that's wanting you to abandon Jesus, let's look at what happened to them and their ancestors. They abandoned God. And it was because of their unbelief that they did this. So now he gets to where we are tonight and where we're going to focus in, is he says, therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. So really, verse 1 here has a lot packed into it. And of course, I've got the therefore to point back and say, okay, we need to remember where we came from in order for us to walk forward. And this chart that I've drawn down here make even more sense. But there are 3 things that really stand out. Let us fear, there's a promise that remains, and then coming short. And so even in this one sentence, there's 3 things that are really standing out. Let us fear. And you notice here that I've circled in this 2 things. Let us fear, and then really wanted to highlight us. So there's 2 things in this. He could have said in this, you should fear. But he includes himself and includes the community. So he's not singling anyone out at this stage, right? And that's important. This us really is so important when it comes down to community. And what he is saying is in the same way that the entire community of Israel in the time of Numbers, when they were on the cusp of entering into the promised land, the entire community fell. It was only Joshua and Caleb that remained. He said, because they didn't have any self-control. He's saying, and because of their example, we as a community of believers in Jesus Christ, we need to fear. And so what is the fear that he's talking about here? Well, this fear is having a faithful fear, not a scared fear, right? a God honoring awe, fear. But there is a also in this, let us remember what they did, and in our own hearts and the awesomeness of God and how we worship God, let us be concerned that we do not track in the same way that they did. Let us be very concerned and fearful in our walk that we don't go all the way to the end and give up, that we grumble and complain and fail the way they failed. So he said, therefore, the community. And so let me pause on the community on this. I've been thinking a lot about this as we have moved over these past few weeks on what it means to be a community of believers. Certainly, we have a community at Mint Hill Baptist Church, and it has been a beautiful thing to see how our community has reached out to one another. But we have an even greater community. We have the community of the church universal. So brothers and sisters in Christ universally. And what I've begun to see, certainly through social media and other avenues, is that that community is breaking down. And it's breaking down in this crisis across so many different lines. It's breaking down when it comes to wearing a mask, of all the silliest things in the world for a community to begin splintering on. Is my freedom to wear or not wear a mask. We're beginning to fracture when it comes to political ideology. We're beginning to fracture when it comes to, Debbie, as you said, should we go back to work? Should we not go back to work? And so as the pendulum swings in one way or the other, whether someone is concerned about going back or someone feels like they should go back, there's anger that's being aimed at one another. And then you take that community that's beginning to fracture there, and then you take a step back to the culture that is very much against churches meeting again. There's a lot that's going on to cause a dissension amongst the brothers and sisters. So that's why this word us is so very important. Because really what he's saying as he begins this process is that it is up to the community of believers to hold one another into account, to hold one another into the awesome fear of God, to hold one another into looking backwards at our ancestors and saying, let us not fail in that way, to hold one another into the community to say there's a promise and we need to obtain that promise. And so I love the fact that the author uses us, that as a pastor preaching to a congregation, he is not separating himself as more pious, but he is saying it is up to all of us to maintain all of us. It is up to all of us to guide and walk and move together, following after Jesus. And so, me personally, my concern as we continue to move through this pandemic and anger rises one with another is that the community of believers united under the banner of Jesus Christ is becoming less united. And small things are beginning to divide us. And so I think for me tonight, if I weren't to say anything else, I would say these three words, let us fear, are so important for us as a community of believers, that it's up to each one of us to hold one another into account, to encourage one another. And he's going to repeat this as we move into 4, while it is still called today to gather, to encourage, to uplift, while we are still given this moment to pour into one another. Because if we fracture and we grumble and we complain, where we should truly be afraid is that we will wind up like the Israelites, who they were discouraged by everything. It didn't matter if it was food or water or travel or anything. The Israelites complained. So he says, no, brothers and sisters, let us collectively be concerned about our collective journey. And let us not let one of our flock go astray. And if they do, it is up to the collective body to encourage that brother or sister. So I just wanted to kind of pause on that for just a moment. And that's why I highlighted these pronouns, is that the they really kind of speaks to an other. Here's this community that failed at it. This us speaks to the new community found in Jesus Christ and saying, let us not fail in the way that they did. Let's take a lesson from them. And then you get down to the more personal you in just a moment. So let's just keep going. So that's the first thing. We need to have a fear, a healthy, godly fear, but also a concern for our brothers and sisters. He goes on, he says, therefore, let us fear if, while a promise remains of entering his rest. And this is such a unique statement to say, while a promise remains. So we go into the next week, we're going to dive into that particular phrase a lot more, the promise that still remains. But what's happening here is that God has given a promise that his people will enter into his rest. And he gave that promise to the Israelites. In fact, so much of the Pentateuch, the first five Bibles, first five books of the Bible, speaks of this promised rest and this promised land. In fact, it's a major theme of the Old Testament of getting to this promised land and receiving a promised rest, so that God has promised his people a rest. And so what the author of Hebrews is saying is that it did not end with the land of Canaan. It didn't end there. We are still given a promised rest. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. He says, so while that promise remains, we need to obtain it. We need to get to that rest, and we need to do so as a community. So as the promise remains of entering his rest, so let's take a quick moment to say, what does rest even mean? Real quick, let me throw it out there, try to make this a little more interactive. If you guys want to unmute, in fact, let me do that for you. Let me unmute you guys if I can. I guess I can't. You guys unmute and let me know when you hear the phrase God's rest, what do you think of? Heaven. All right, Heather says heaven. Right now, everybody's muted, so I can't unmute you, unfortunately. I tried.
I think of peace.
Peace.
I think of peace, tranquility, no problems.
No problems. These are all excellent. Excellent. So what's being implied by the language, if we dig into it, is that rest really equals completeness. That right now we live in a state of incomplete. Our relationship with the Lord is incomplete because of the fact that we are still here and we are still stymied by our own sin, but that we are going to be promised a rest of completeness. So when you think of the rest, and the author of Hebrews is going to spell this out in great detail coming up, is that when God rested, what did God do? Did he stop? On the seventh day, did God stop doing anything? Is he up there twiddling his thumbs waiting on us? And the answer to that is no, he's not. When it means that God rested, it means that his creation was complete and that he rested in enjoyment of it. So that's what really rest means for us. These definitions that you guys gave are great. It's heaven, it's peace, it's no problems. But the beauty of it is that it's complete worship of God. It's complete enjoyment of him. It's something that while we can taste it now, we have not fully obtained it. This is the now and not yet aspect of our walk. It's complete enjoyment of God, free from any stress, free from any sin. It's free from anything that would inhibit us. So I'm going to put no inhibitions. I know that can have a negative connotation, but here it has a very huge positive connotation. So no stress, no sin, no uh, anything that inhibits our worship with God. So when he is offering us rest, it's a return to Eden.
Mm.
It's a return to Eden. And this is the beauty of the Bible and its symbology, right? Its types. Eden is a land. God has promised the Israelites a land. He has promised us a land. But in each case, it's supposed to be a return to a perfect relationship with him. And as we go further and further into Hebrews, this will even be opened up even more. And it's a beautiful thing. But that's what rest is. It's a complete enjoyment of God, free from stress, sin, and those things that would inhibit our worship of him, a complete return to Eden. So he says, so we need to, as a community, watch out that we're not like our old community, but that we need to bear in mind that the promise of perfect rest is still available to us. It did not end with our forefathers. It is still something that we can keep our eye on and say there is a return to Eden promised for us. The promises of God never fail and never end, right? So the promise remains, and he says, okay, so while this promise remains of entering God's rest, of having that completeness, he said, any one of you may seem to have come short of it. Don't let this happen. That's what we want to fear, is that any one of us would come short of it. So we need to understand what that come short means. So I turn it over to you all, the Reiners, if you would turn to Numbers 14, 1 through 10, and let's read exactly what this means, because I love that the NASB has translated this perfectly.
Okay. So Numbers 14, starting with verse 1. So all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. And all of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. Why has the Lord brought us to this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and children should become victims? Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us select a leader and return to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before all of the assembly of the congregation of the children of Israel.
And Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephthah, which were of them that searched the land, rent their clothes. And they spake unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, the land which you passed through to search it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into the land and give it us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the Lord of the land, neither fear ye the people of the land. For they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. But all the congregation bade stone them with stones, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the congregation for all the children of Israel.
Okay, so this is the coming short. And, you know, the story, of course, continues, but contextually, where we are in Numbers is that the spies have entered the land, they've come back, and that 10 of the spies have reported that there are giants in the land and we shouldn't go in, and that Caleb and Joshua have said this is a good land and we need to take it, we need to go in. And let us remember that the entire time, as I scoot down to here, here's the people, the Israelites, that God has given them a guide in Moses to bring them to this promised land, land of Canaan, and that he has said in this, I go before you. I open up the land. All you need to do is walk in and take possession of it. And part of that walking in and taking possession is to purge the evil from the land and kill the inhabitants. But you're not going to have to do that by yourself. In fact, I go before you. I'm taking away all their defenses. I'm sending in hornets. I'm sending in angels. The people will be wiped out. You just need to be faithful to do it, right? That's the command. And so the Israelites have left Egypt and have complained and grumbled against God the entire time. And last week we were looking at the waters of Meribah and Massa, where they complained against God. And that is a defining moment in Israel's history that just proves that their hearts were hard. And the final death knell for all this, for the Israelites, is in all this complaining, is that they have walked all the way to the border of the promised land. They are camped outside the border. And God has said, go in. And what do we see in the text that we just read? The children of Israel complained against Moses and said, if only we had died in Egypt, if only we had died in the wilderness. And so they said to one another, let us appoint a new leader. So the Israelites have come all the way to the promised land, and what they have said in this is no, kill Moses. They said they were going to stone them, kill them. We don't want the guide anymore. We reject the land. And so by default, if they reject the land, what are they rejecting? God's rest, God's peace. And see, Joshua and Caleb beg them. God has done this. God has paved a way. Let us not reject and rebel against him. And so what do the people do? They, of course, reject and they rebel. And so this is happening on the cusp of this moment. And this is what the author of Hebrews is saying. The people, the community that was before us, went all the way to the border of the promised land, and they came short of it. At the last moment, they failed. But really what he is saying is their failure started all the way back at the waters of Meribah and Massa. And their heart hardened there, and it just kept hardening. And so even when they are at the promised land, they reject God. And of course, God rejects them if you carry on with the story. And he says, they wanted to die in the wilderness, so be it. They can't come in. And of course, what do? They try to storm the land of Canaan, and they are beaten back. And this again echoes Eden. This is the beauty of the Bible. In the same way that Adam and Eve are rejected and they are cast out of Eden, God puts a cherubim with a flaming sword who will not allow them to re-enter. And in the same way that the people of Israel reject the promised land, in the same way that their forefathers, Adam and Eve, rejected Eden, they are beaten back. They're not allowed to come in. Only Joshua and Caleb, who are faithful to say, God is doing this, they are allowed to come back in. So this is what the author is using the story of the people's ancestors to say, don't be like them. In fact, we need to be so concerned about our own hearts that they don't become hard in this way, that you fail at the last moment, you trip and you fail. And so this is so important to the entire story of this, right? But then we get to verse 2. And in verse 2, he explains what he's talking about. He says, for indeed, we have had good news preached to us just as they also. Now, that's an interesting phrase, right? Because this good news is evangelion or evangelios and all the translations that come with the Greek. Same way where we get to evangelize, good news. And so when we think of good news, we of course think of the good news of Jesus. So he's saying, what good news was preached to us? Well, the good news of Jesus Christ, but how does it apply to them as well? Well, let's look. And I just got our 10-minute warning, so I'm going to kind of speed myself up. So this whole thing that I've drawn out down here, people, guide, promised land, promised rest, that's good news. The good news is that God gives a guide and has offered a promised land and has offered a promised rest. So our good news is this. Who are the people? spiritual Israel. And of course, spiritual Israel are those who are believers. Now, he's going to state that in just a moment. Who's the guide? Jesus. Jesus is our guide into the promised land. And what is the promised land? Heaven. And what is the promised rest? Well, it's the same as it's ever been. Rest, peace, peace with God, complete. Same news, right? You're my people. I give you a guide. I'm giving you a land, and I'm giving you a rest. And the beauty of this is, even as we look at the promised land and we see that heaven is the greater Canaan and heaven is the greater Eden, that, of course, Jesus is the greater guide. So he's greater than Moses. He's greater than Joshua, and that Jesus gives us the superior rest, because with him, there is no failure, whereas there was failure with Moses and Joshua because of the people. So we are receiving the same good news as they did. They didn't recognize it as good news. How do we know that they didn't recognize it as good news? Because of this word right here, unbelief. They didn't believe it. They rejected what God was doing. They didn't follow what Joshua and Caleb were saying, is that God goes before, right? So he summarizes again, our author of Hebrews says, okay, so we've been given good news as they have been given news. The good news is promised rest, a promised land. He said, but the word they heard did not profit them. See, they were preached to the entire time. God had given them the Ten Commandments. God had given them the law. God had given them Moses and the prophets and everything else. They rejected it, right? The word that they heard did not profit them. Why? Because it was not united by faith in those who heard it. It was not united by faith. And you see that I've circled this right here. United by faith is so important. And the word heard. So let's come to the verses that I've laid out here. So Romans 10, 16, and 17. Brother Sam, I think you had that one.
Yes, I sure do. It says, but they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah saith, Lord, who hath believed our report? So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God.
Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. So there is in Romans, we see there is a true hearing, right? So that gives us this, heard. There's a true hearing. And that true hearing should have a faith that is produced. So it should be united in faith. Well, that brings us to James 1:22, one of my all-time favorite verses. My love, you have that?
Do not be hearers of the word only, but be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves.
Be doers of the word and not hearers only. So we once again have in Hebrews a different author than James, who is giving us the same message, who's giving the same message that Paul is giving, is that you can hear and it can just bounce off. It has to be united in faith. There has to be belief that works with the hearing. And of course, belief is not lip service. See, the children of Israel paid lip service to God. In their heart, they didn't believe. And so what they heard and what they saw and what was preached to them was heard by them, but they rejected it constantly. It was not united in faith. But here, the author of Hebrews is telling us, how do we avoid the same pitfall as our forefathers, as the community that failed? Well, we have to believe, and that belief has to translate into action. And in fact, I didn't bring it into tonight, but I'm going to kind of close with this. And we're going to see this as we move into next week, is if you go to the next verse, in verse 3, it says, for we who have believed enter that rest. And then he goes on for more. But let me just pause right there. For we who believed have entered that rest. Now, what's interesting about that is the word believed there is in past tense and enter is in present tense. That's very interesting when you look at the Greek for that reason. So what does that mean? It means that we have past tense believed, i.e. we've heard and we've united it with belief, but the present tense enter means something that's happening today. Hence his continually hitting on that word today. Let me equate it for us as we kind of come to a close here. Is when we look at people, guide, promised land, and promised rest, and we look at what happened at the Israelites' failure to enter in, is that God says, here's the land, I'm leading you to it, step into it, and as you step into it, purge the evil from the land. Now, your purging is just faithfulness to do it. I'm going to be the one that's actually going to do the purging, but you must be faithful to lift the sword and strike down that which is evil. And so the same thing is being said to us as believers. You have believed. You are entering into the promised land. The kingdom has already begun manifest in Jesus, that now has manifest in us, and yet we're in between two worlds. We are kingdom-minded people. But what does he say? What is it? How do we enter into the promised land in the same way that we see the Israelites do later on? Well, we step into what has been promised to us, and that we are to slay the evil in our life day by day, as long as it's called today. And that we are to knock down sin in our life. But are we the ones that actually do that? No. God, through his Spirit, does it for us. We have to be faithful to lift the sword and to attack the sin in our life and to purge the evil from the land. Now, another beautiful thing that we're going to see as we move forward is that Jesus has, through his blood, purchased for us the perfect promised land. And he has cleansed it and he's purified it, and it will have no evil. And he does the same for us. He cleanses us and he purifies us and he purges us of all evil to make us prepared for that perfect promised land and the perfect promised rest. So that's why I only wanted to do 2 verses tonight, because there's a lot just in 2 verses. But it's beautiful, and it really lets us see the Old Testament in a new light. This is telling me that we're within less than a minute. So there may be questions that you guys have. Feel free to reach out. Since it's the 4 of us, you guys can just reach out to me. I'd love to answer those. I love you guys. And if you choose to come on Sunday, I look forward to seeing you there. And if you don't, that's all good. And I will see you online. But thank you for your faithfulness. And I pray that this has been beneficial to you guys. I love you very much.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you, Pastor.
Thank you. Good night,
Thank you,
guys.
guys. Good night.
Good night.
Bye, guys.
Bye, bye-bye.